We spent the last few units looking at the nervous system and various aspects of it. We're now going to move on to the endocrine system, which is closely linked with the nervous system. Ultimately, the nervous system and the endocrine system are the main communicating and coordinating systems in the body, helping to coordinate and maintain homeostasis. However, the nervous system and endocrine system are different from each other slightly in terms of how they do this and their overall effects. So let's start with the nervous system. The nervous system communicates, as we've seen, through electrical signals called nerve impulses. Those communicate information very rapidly. So, to use an example, under a stressful situation, let's say all of a sudden I was scared, I have a very quick nervous signal that goes down to my heart and starts causing my heart to beat much faster. It doesn't take very long, as you may have experienced, in order for that reaction to occur. At the same time, however, nervous system signals are very short-acting. To use the same example, the nerve impulse that then causes my heart to beat faster is only very short-lasting and would only keep my heart beating faster for a very short amount of time. If you've had that experience before, where you've been scared and your heart has beat fast, you'll know that it doesn't usually last a very short amount of time. But that's because of the endocrine system. The endocrine system communicates through chemical signals called hormones. The endocrine system usually responds more slowly, but it exerts longer lasting effects. So to continue with this example of stress, our adrenal glands, found here on top of our kidneys, will release stress hormones when under stress. If you've ever been scared before, but maybe by accident, your heart starts racing right away, and then a while later you might notice, oh, my heart's still beating really fast, even though the thing that scared me was not anything to actually be afraid of. That's because the adrenal glands have released the stress hormone, epinephrine, and it's causing your heart to beat faster and your breathing rate to be faster, and other effects on your body that the stress hormone causes. Let's zoom in then on the endocrine system here. The endocrine system is made up of endocrine glands, as shown here, and in the second portion of this unit, you'll spend the time looking at these endocrine glands, learning their names, and then also looking at the hormones that they ultimately release, because that is what endocrine glands do. They release chemical substances called hormones that then go on and have an effect in the body. Endocrine glands are ductless, and they secrete hormones directly into the blood. A hormone then is a chemical messenger that travels through the blood to some other region of the body, causing an effect. So for example, the pituitary gland releases luteinizing hormone that ultimately will travel down to the testes in this case, or the ovaries in the case of a female, and what it will trigger is some response in the testes. In this case, the luteinizing hormone causes the testes to actually release another hormone, testosterone. The testosterone is then released and will go and have an effect on things like muscles, causing muscles to repair and grow. Some concepts that we should take a look at then are the concepts of stimulus, target tissue, and response. And we've kind of seen that already in this very quick example of testosterone. The stimulus is what actually causes the hormone to be released in the first place. So going back to the example of stress that we mentioned earlier on in this video, the adrenal gland is stimulated actually by the nervous system in order to release the stress hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. In the case we just saw, the pituitary gland releases luteinizing hormone, and the luteinizing hormone goes down to the testes and causes the release of testosterone. So the stimulus for the testes is actually the luteinizing hormone. The other concept we need to look at is the target tissue. Specific glands release specific hormones that ultimately have effects on specific tissues. So in the cartoon image here, what's being shown is a gland that has a bow and arrow, and the arrow being the hormone, and it's going to go and have an effect on specific tissues. So for example, let's say this hormone was antidiuretic hormone, which you'll learn about later in the unit. This hormone ultimately will have an effect on the kidney. And even though it's traveling through the blood, and the blood will travel through the liver and through the bones shown here, the antidiuretic hormone will only have its effect on the target tissue, the kidney, telling the kidney to retain water. The response then depends on the type of hormone. There are two major categories of hormones. The first are protein hormones. What we can see here is that protein hormones don't actually enter into a cell to cause their effect. This system is called a secondary messenger system. The protein hormone is released from some gland, it travels through the blood, and then will get to a cell and bind to receptors specific to that hormone. As we just mentioned, hormones affect a target tissue. When the protein hormone binds to the receptor in the cell membrane, it actually causes a reaction where we have a secondary messenger, in this case the cAMP, being produced. The cAMP is produced out of ATP and then goes around the cell and activates enzymes, causing then changes in the cell. An example of this would be the epinephrine that we've mentioned a few times now. Epinephrine is a protein hormone that will bind to a receptor, causing the secondary messenger cAMP to be produced within the cell, and that secondary messenger will go and activate enzymes that take glycogen from the cell and cause it to break down into glucose, and the glucose be used by the cell for energy. This is one of the responses of the stress hormone epinephrine. It causes glucose to be released from glycogen so we can use it to produce more energy. The second type of hormone that we're going to look at are steroid hormones. So these are lipid-based because steroids are within the group of lipids that we saw earlier in the course. And the way steroid hormones work is that they actually enter the cell. They cross the plasma membrane, they will enter into the nucleus, and then bind to a receptor. In binding to a receptor, they will then affect the DNA, causing stimulation of protein synthesis. One example of a steroid hormone is testosterone. If, for example, I was to go to the gym later on today, I would, as I lifted weights, be damaging my muscle tissue. What happens after I end my workout is that I release testosterone. This steroid hormone travels around the blood to all of my muscles, will enter into those cells, bind to receptors in the nucleus, and then cause protein synthesis, so that my muscles will repair the proteins that have been damaged, ultimately making my muscles stronger. So we should be able to contrast the protein hormones and steroid hormones in terms of how they function. The protein hormones do not enter the cell, but make use of a secondary messenger system, where the steroid hormones enter into the cell nucleus and stimulate protein synthesis. So how are hormones regulated? The key method for regulating hormones are negative feedback loops. Let's take a look at an example in order to understand the concept of a negative feedback loop. If we look at the anterior pituitary gland, so the pituitary gland, as you'll learn later in the unit, is within the brain, and there's a front half and a back half to it, an anterior and a posterior region. The anterior pituitary gland releases a number of hormones. But if we look at one, ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, the anterior pituitary gland will release that ACTH in order to cause changes in the adrenal cortex. The adrenal gland, as mentioned previously, is the gland that is above the kidneys, and it will respond to the ACTH by releasing cortisol. It releases cortisol into the blood to cause changes to allow us to deal with long-term stress. But the cortisol, in traveling around the blood, also travels back to the anterior pituitary. And it tells the anterior pituitary, I'm here. Cortisol has been released by the adrenal cortex. The ACTH has caused its response. The anterior pituitary gland then, when coming into contact with the cortisol, will stop releasing the ACTH because it has accomplished what it wanted to ultimately do, which is have the release of cortisol. This again is the main type of feedback loop we have in the body controlling hormones. We have the negative feedback loop because what happens is I have the release of a hormone that then triggers the release of another hormone that tells the original gland to stop releasing its stimulatory hormone. A second method of hormone regulation that occurs a lot less often than negative feedback loops are positive feedback loops. The main example for positive feedback loops that occurs in the body is actually something that occurs in females, specifically females that are pregnant. So birthing of a baby is actually an example of positive feedback loops. What happens when the baby is ready to be born is that the baby's head pushes up against the cervix. The cervix has stretch receptors that sense that stress, send signals to the brain to stimulate the release of oxytocin by the posterior pituitary gland. After the posterior pituitary releases the oxytocin, it travels through the blood down to the muscles of the uterus. It then causes the muscles of the uterus to contract. As the muscles of the uterus contract, it pushes on the baby, and the baby's head pushes down on the cervix more and more, therefore increasing the pressure on the cervix, sending signals back to the brain, causing more release of oxytocin. And this cycle continues where we have more and more oxytocin being released, and this cycle actually continues until the baby is actually birthed. So again, hormones are regulated through negative and positive feedback loops, but negative feedback loops are the main way that the hormones are regulated.